Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Jackie, and I work in the outreach department here at the library. We're very honored to have this ongoing partnership with U of M. It's one of my favorite programs that we do here. Just a couple things before we get started. This program is being recorded, so we can stream it for accessibility. And because of that, I'm going to ask that questions be saved to the end of the event. And I will walk around with the microphone and ask everyone to speak into the mic. I know, I'm sorry, so that we can capture the audio. And secondly, I have hearing assistance devices that we can provide if anybody has trouble hearing the program at any point. So just raise your hand if that happens, and my colleagues and I will get you set up. Okay, thank you.
I'm going to be careful and not mess anything up, Susan. Great. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Chris Monk. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology. Tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Susan Gelman, who will be sharing her research on children's cognitive development. Dr. Gelman is the Heinz Werner Distinguished University Professor of Psychology and Linguistics here at the University of Michigan. She received her undergraduate degree from Oberlin College and her Ph.D. from Stanford. Dr. Gelman conducts research on how children think and learn. More specifically, her work examines children's development of category formation, causal reasoning, and relationships between language and thought. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, as well as the Templeton Foundation. Dr. Gelman has an incredible number of commendations and awards. Here, I'm just going to highlight a few. She is an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences. She is an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She gave the Henry Russell Lectureship, which is considered the University of Michigan's highest honor. And finally, she received mentoring awards from both the American Psychological Association and our very own department also. So in addition to being an amazing researcher, she's a phenomenal mentor and teacher as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Gelman.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you all for being here. It's great to have an in-person audience as well as the people who are watching the streaming. So I wanted to start by telling you what I call the paradox of the preschooler. They can't read, but they learn language with ease. They believe in monsters, but they may know more dinosaur facts than you do. They can't add 7 plus 4, but they intuitively grasp statistical patterns. And they lose at checkers, but they're great at coming up with creative solutions. So it's, for me, studying children is, they're fascinating creatures, they're very charming, but also they give us a window onto the human mind. And I think we can see it with this paradox. On the one hand, children tell us about how human learning takes place. They're the most remarkable learners on the planet. If you think about all the learning that goes on between 0 and 5, it's beyond any other 5-year period in our lives. But also they have certain biases and limitations, and by studying what they are in children, we are able to see more clearly our own biases and limitations as adults. So I'm going to focus here on categories, which is just really how we organize experience into groups. And categories are important, and they're everywhere. They're at the core of how we organize our environment. So from library shelves to grocery stores, categories are also at the heart of political and moral debates among adults. But the world doesn't come prepackaged into these categories. These are constructions that we humans create. So why are we doing this? What are categories doing for us? Well, if you look at the textbooks, they will all say that categories are important for efficiency. They help us, sort facts into groups that make it easier for us to deal with the complexity of our environments. I think that's true. I think that's important, but I don't think it could be the whole story. I think when we're putting something into a category, we're doing more than just sorting facts into file folders. And in my opinion, our categories are like miniature theories. And I want to illustrate this with a concept called essentialism. That will be the theme throughout the talk today. If you've never heard of it before, that's totally fine. I do not assume that you know what essentialism is. But I want to illustrate it by having you think about that animal there. So that's a wolf pup, very cute, very adorable. You might think you'd want to take it home and be your pet, but maybe not, and that's where the iceberg comes in. So on the one hand, we can think about this wolf in terms of its appearance and behavior, and as a young creature, it is adorable and completely safe. But we also have these other beliefs about this creature, that it has an innate disposition to be wild, that it has a biological potential to grow in a certain way and attack other humans, that it has certain internal parts and blood that are characteristically wolf-like. And we might have this idea that there's something that causes it to be a wolf, that causes it to have this innate disposition. This something is what I'm calling an essence. Now, as educated adults, you might have a very well-informed belief about what that essence might be for something like a wolf. Maybe you think it's like something about its DNA, for example. But you don't even have to know what the essence is to believe that there is one. You just, as long as you have this belief that there's something deeply inherent about wolves as a category, something that makes them what they are, even if you don't know what it is, it might just be this like essence placeholder that still fits with this model of essentialism. Now, essentialism can be like a really smart way of thinking about the world. If you don't think that appearances are everything, you can accept that animal on the left is a lizard. It is, in fact, a lizard. It looks like a snake, but scientists have discovered that it has the internal parts of a lizard. They're descended from lizards, but they lost their legs back in evolutionary time. And you can understand that middle creature is not a leaf or set of leaves, but it's a leaf insect. And then the one on the right, that's known as fool's gold. It's pyrite, it's not gold at all, it's worthless, but people were fooled into thinking it was gold, but they learned that it wasn't, they accept that. So you can be, if you think that there's something deeper that makes an item what it is, that's smart. At the same time, it's really important to realize that essentialism can be biased. So some of you may remember this book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. That book is sort of claiming that men and women are in these completely different categories with a sharp boundary between them, and they're opposite to each other. But if you actually look at the psychological data on gender differences, and people have studied these in depth for decades, most psychological gender differences are at about that size. That's a 0.2 size effect. That's a statistically significant difference. Often what you'll hear reported about how men and women are different, but it's tiny. There's much more overlap than there is difference, even though that is significant. So differences in communication, personality, cognitive skills are very, very small. And so the essentialist view is the one on the left, and it doesn't account for that variability. Another example of bias, this was from a national survey that was conducted to look at how people understand genetics, and they had a series of questions, and people were asked to agree or disagree with the questions, with the statements. And this particular item I'm just pulling out because it's an example of an essentialist belief that is false, and the majority of participants in the study, a large study with thousands of people, over 50% agreed with the false statement. Two people from the same race will always be more genetically similar to each other than two people from different races. Again, even considering race as a biological category is problematic, but this is a very essentialist way of thinking of these as completely distinct, non-overlapping groups. Another place that we see bias and essentialism is how social distinctions, such as caste or social class, can be perceived as natural, inevitable, and fixed. And there's some beautiful work by Ram Mahalingam in my department who studied beliefs about the Indian caste system. And he found that people at the top of the caste system, the more privileged group, the Brahmins, believe that if you're born into a certain caste, that is your caste for life, even if you're adopted by someone of a different caste, even if you're switched at birth in the hospital and nobody knows about it, nonetheless, your caste is who you are deep down inside. So again, essentialism. Now, essentialism, I think, is very important when you look at the consequences for adults. It's predictive of a range of social consequences. I'll just mention a few of them. So the more that people essentialize race and gender, the more they're likely to stereotype and reveal prejudices. The more people essentialize criminal behavior, the more they endorse harsher punishment for criminals, including the death penalty. The more people essentialize language, the more they reject bilingual education policies for schooling. And the more people essentialize a range of categories, the more they endorse policies that support boundaries between groups, different social policies. We looked at a range of them. And this last one holds true even if you control for education level, political conservatism, religiosity, and some other factors. So I think essentialism is important, and what I'm going to spend my time talking about, why we essentialize, that will be the bulk of what I talk about, but also I'll say a little bit about the role of culture and experience, and I will also talk a little bit about how language can foster essentialist beliefs. Okay, so why do we essentialize? Now here's where we actually get back to kids. By studying children, I'm part of a very distinguished tradition, I would say. These are examples of different writers and scholars and scientists who have gone to children to try to answer questions about why are adults the way they are. So Herodotus has a famous example where he talks about this. I won't go into it, but he was interested in what the original language was, and he reported a study that involved newborn babies being raised without language, probably apocryphal, but it still reveals the importance of children for answering big questions. Plato talked about where our beliefs about mathematics and geometry come from by looking at a young child. Darwin talked about emotions by studying young children. And of course, Jean Piaget, famous Swiss developmental psychologist who's like the grandfather of cognitive development, he was interested, he always said he was interested in how humans construct knowledge. That was his question. But he chose to look at children to answer that. And I think the idea here is that, of course, it's very important and interesting to understand how adults think, but adults have layers and layers of education and experience and knowledge and so forth. And if we can peel back those layers to see how people are thinking before all of that is added on, it tells us something new and important. Okay, so what can children tell us about essentialism? I started doing this work actually back in graduate school, which I will tell you was over 40 years ago, so I've been doing this for a long time. And at that point, the received wisdom was that young children are concrete thinkers. You know, think of that iceberg again, they're just like looking at what's on top of the water, what they can see. And there is a ton of research consistent with this view. It is true that children are much more captivated by superficial, irrelevant features than we are as adults. A beautiful example of this is from a test that Piaget used. Some of you may be familiar with it. The task involves showing children two identical glasses of liquid that are exactly the same height, the exact same shape. The child agrees that they're identical in amount, and then taking one of them and pouring it into a taller, skinnier glass, and then, as the child's watching, and then asking, okay, now, you know, does this one have more, does that one have more, or are they both the same? And children below about 6 or 7 say, oh, that one has more. Because they're so fixated on the appearance and that higher, you know, the higher level of the liquid, that's all they care about. And even if you look at how children categorize, if you give kids like a range of objects to sort, or you ask them to put together the things that are the same kind of thing, you will find that young children will focus, you know, not on vehicles and food and clothing, but superficial features that shouldn't matter, like the two red things go together, or these two brown things that are sort of cylindrical go together. So they're bad at categorizing, and they focus on surface appearances. You would think that they're not going to essentialize at all. However, it's important to keep in mind that children are not growing up in a world where they have to build categories from scratch. They are learning words from other people from, you know, the moment they're born born into a language environment. You know, categories are being expressed by people around them with language, with words. And I think the really relevant question here is not what categories can children create when they're left to their own devices, because the answer for that will be not very good, relevant ones. They'll have a lot of trouble with it. But the question here is, what do children expect about those categories that they're hearing from others? These categories are passed down from generation to generation to generation through words. Are they thinking that these categories are telling them something more than just what something looks like or how it behaves? So, for example, consider if you asked a 4-year-old, you know, to explain, you know, what's a wolf or what's a dog or what's the difference between a wolf and a dog, I guarantee they will not be able to give you a satisfactory answer. But what do they do when they hear, this one's a wolf and that one's a dog? Just that simple information, what did they do with those labels? What inferences follow? And when we shift to this question of what children think a category is doing for them, what it's telling them about the world, it turns out that this reveals a whole host of inferences that we hadn't seen before. So I'm going to tell you about sort of a summary of a number of different studies that we've done over the years. We've interviewed thousands of children over the years. Some have been in our lab. I have a lab in the East Hall of the psychology building at U of M. We have this wonderful partnership with local museums. It's called the Living Lab. And we also do testing online. That started, guess when, spring of 2020. And in all of the studies that I'll tell you about, you'll see that we didn't come right out and ask children directly, what's the essence of a dog, or do you essentialize, or anything like that. Instead, we devised a variety of tasks to try to get converging evidence on how children think about this issue. If they think there's more than appearances, more than meets the eye, inherent qualities, and so forth. So this is just a book that I published a while ago that presents a summary of some of these findings, and so some of the examples that I give will be from that. Not all of them, though. Okay, so this one piece of evidence is that children think that a category is immutable, that it can't change. Once a raccoon, always a raccoon. This is a very clever study done by Frank Kyle, a psychologist at Yale, and he showed children like a series of items, but like, for example, a raccoon, and then he said a scientist came and did an operation on that raccoon, painted a white stripe down its back, took out some of the fat inside of it, inserted a smelly sack, and it ended up like that. And then the kids were asked, what is that? Is that a raccoon or a skunk? And by second grade, children very reliably said, that's a raccoon. You can't turn a raccoon into a skunk. I don't care how much it looks like a skunk, it's not, it's still a raccoon. Another example, this was research that I did with various colleagues, starting with Ellen Markman, was to see whether kids thought that members of a category had some underlying reality, underlying commonality. So we would tell children the labels, this one, again, many examples, but let's say we'd say this is a bird I have to stay by here. The flamingo, we'd say this is a bird, this is a bat, and this is a bird. And then we taught them a fact about the top two animals, like this bird feeds its baby mashed up food, and this bat feeds its baby milk. And then we said, what does this bird feed its baby, for example? And children would make inferences based on the shared category membership. That bird would have the same behavior, same internal parts, whatever we had taught them, as the other bird, and not of the bat, even though it looks much more like the bat. Children also think that nature overpowers nurture. So we told them about a baby animal of one species, for example, a baby rabbit that went and lived with a family of monkeys. Never saw another rabbit, just was raised by the monkeys, only saw monkey things. It was, completely an all-monkey environment. And then they were asked, when that rabbit grows up, will it like to eat carrots or will it like to eat bananas? Will it be good at hopping or will it be good at climbing? And the preschool children were adamant that, it's a rabbit, it's going to have rabbit preferences, it's going to have rabbit behaviors. Children also think that insides are especially important. We were interested in this because there's some reporting in the literature that maybe up to about a third of adults think that if they get an organ transplant, they're worried that they might take on some properties of their donor. This is like a legitimate concern that people have. And so we wanted to see if this belief would be there in kids. And so we told them about if a person swapped a heart with an animal, for example, a pig. So it was like both were fine, like we made sure like nobody was hurt, they both recovered fully, but what if a person had a heart from a pig inside of them? And children reported that the person would become a little bit more like a pig. They would still be a person, but they might want to roll around in the mud a little bit. And we also did this with traits. So like, what if someone got a heart from a really mean girl? We had a whole little description of how mean that girl was. What if, a person swapped hearts with that girl, and they thought that the person would become a little bit meaner? Again, preschool children. And I'll just give you one more example of these studies of early essentialism. Children also seem to think, sort of like the men are from Mars, women are from Venus, that like certain categories have this like sharp boundary. Like there's, sure, girls and boys are different, but they think that they're so different you can't even consider them the same type of person. So we had a scenario where kids heard about this character from far, far away named Feppy, and Feppy and all of his friends and all of his family thought that these were these two were the same kind of person. Could they maybe be right? And preschoolers were adamant, no, you cannot consider them the same kind of person, even though there are many respects in which they are the same kind of person. Okay, so to recap, the data suggests that children are like these little essentialists. Now, the research that I've been telling you about has been, primarily in the US, in English, middle class largely samples, and it does raise a question of how general these beliefs are. Like maybe it's something specific to just one part of the world, or kids having a certain kind of upbringing. So it's really important to know how culture and experience might shape essentialism. And of course, the only way to do that is to look at how people are thinking about these issues around the world. And this just shows some of the research. Each pin represents either one or more papers or books done in different parts of the world. This represents over 7,000 participants in dozens of scholarly writings. Some are experiments, some are ethnographies. And there's a very interesting result if you kind of span over all of this diverse work that's been done. On the one hand, if you look at how people think about natural categories, like categories of animals and plants, you see universally essentialism of these categories. That seems to be a very easy way of thinking about the natural world, that there's more than meets the eye, there's kind of deeper basis to these categories. But when you look at social categories of different types of people, huge variation across the world in terms of which categories are essentialized, how much they're essentialized, when they're essentialized, and so on. So there seems to be like a very broad tendency to essentialize, but culture and experience definitely are playing an important role. I'm going to give you, almost none of this work was I involved in. I read it with great interest, but I will tell you about one study that I was involved with. It was done by one of my former Ph.D. students, Marjorie Rhodes, who's now a professor at NYU. And we looked at, I guess you'd call it contextual variation in essentialism. But interestingly enough, these are of two communities that are in the US, and in fact, 2 communities that are in Michigan, and in fact, there are 2 communities in Southeast Michigan. I won't tell you what the cities are. One of them you might be able to guess. So I'm going to be telling you about Marjorie's dissertation, and then we've done other studies sort of looking at not these exact 2 communities, but that same kind of contrast. I'm going to call the 2 communities college town and small town. And they're different in so many different ways. They're alike in certain ways, and they're different in other ways. So they're different in size. College town was bigger. Education, the college town has more educated, on average, more educated population. Family income is higher in the college town. There's more ethnic and racial diversity in the college town. So we're not going to be able to pinpoint and say, here's, to the extent that we find differences, which I haven't shown you yet, we're not going to be able to pinpoint why, but just know that these are different communities in certain respects. Now, in other respects are very similar. So all of the children and let me just kind of put this here. We had children between 5 and 17. They were all in public schools. They were matched for age. And the counties were actually neighboring counties. So they're maybe something like 75 miles apart. So they're in the same, general cultural community of Midwestern US, but with these other differences. And we were really interested in whether essentialism of social categories, and remember the research is showing that social categories seem to be variable depending on where in the world the research is done, we were interested in whether we would see differences for gender or for race. So I first want to show you, and I'm not going to go into detail about the particular methods for this study, but it was an essentialist assessment. So the higher the bars that you'll see, the more essentialist the kids are. And the younger ages, these are 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds, did not show any differences between the college town and the small town. They were not statistically different. Those tiny differences are not meaningful. But what you do see is that the kids were highly essentialist about gender, and they were not essentialist about race. They were aware of how to identify people, with racial labels, and we determined that, but they were not essentializing race. They just thought that race is a difference, but not one that really has any consequences below the surface. What's interesting, though, is we did see differences between these 2 communities, these 2 neighboring communities, at the older ages. And what you see is that the kids in the small town maintained that gender essentialism, and now we're consistently essentializing race as well, whereas the kids in the college town had lower levels of gender essentialism compared to the younger kids, and somewhat lower levels of race essentialism as well. So really substantial differences, and I think it's instructive that even when you don't have to go to different parts of the world to see effects. Okay, so kids are they have to be picking up on cues from their environment. Those results are telling us there's something there that is relevant. And it's a big question to ask, what are those cues? I would think that there may be many layers of cues of many different types. So my question here, or what we then proceeded to look at, is not the full range of cues, but we're especially interested in language, partly because, as I said before, children are really tuned into language. They're learning, they're surrounded by language from birth, and this is a quote from 2 evolutionary biologists that I like. They say that human speech is the decisive step in the origin of specifically human society, and that's because language allows us to very readily transmit ideas from one generation to the next. It's how we accumulate knowledge over generations. So it's a very, very important piece of what it means to be human and what it means to live in a human society. And of course, other species have sophisticated communication, but we're the only species, as far as we know, that has anything like the expressive capacity of a human language. Okay, so what did we do? We started by recording, transcribing, and analyzing hours and hours of conversations between parents and their young children. These are just two covers of two monographs that we published on some of our work on this. It's a cute example of one of the parent-child dyads in one of our studies. And the conversations were fascinating. There are all kinds of, very interesting things going on. However, there were no explicit essentialist messages in these conversations. They just weren't there. So, and we tried to deliberately prompt them. Like, we would have, the bats and a bird, so that the kid would mislabel it, which they often did. And then we thought, well, maybe the parents will say something like, well, this bat has an inborn bat essence, and the bird doesn't. No. Or these were two eels and a snake. And we thought maybe they would say, oh, the eel and the snake have different DNA. No, nothing like that. However, we found, and this was something we were not looking for, it just sort of gradually came to our attention by seeing this over and over again in the conversations, that there were these implicit messages that we thought maybe implied essentialism. I'm going to show you two examples, and you may think, well, that's not essentialism. But so you'll have to listen to why I think it may be prompting essentialism. Bats come out at nighttime. Snakes like to live on land. These are examples from one of our studies of things that kids were hearing, very young children were hearing from their parents. And one 20-month-olds and 35-month-olds, so these are kids not quite 2 and not quite 3, are hearing these kinds of generalizations. Now, we thought it was interesting how they're making these plural statements often when there was only one example on the page. We're like, I wonder what's going on. Why are they doing this so often? And why are they only doing it for the animals, not for the artifacts like chairs and tables and hats? And then we discovered a literature that linguists and philosophers have been studying for quite some time called generics. Generics are like this fascinating puzzle because they refer to categories, not individuals. So things like girls wear pink, birds lay eggs, professors are absent-minded. By referring to categories, they're glossing over exceptions. Certainly not all girls wear pink. Male birds don't lay eggs. Baby birds don't lay eggs. Probably the minority of birds that actually lay eggs. And I'd like to think that not all professors are absent-minded, but that's something to be studied, I suppose. But what's important here is that they're going beyond the obvious. They're abstractions. Like when you want to teach a child a word, you could point to a cup and say, that's a cup. There is no way to point to girls as a category, past, present, and future, birds as a category. So there are these abstractions. It's treating the group as a single entity. And it turns out that this tendency to make general claims about categories is found in every language that has been studied. It's in, as I said, very common in the speech to young children. And children start producing these by the time they're about 2.5. But still, okay, I argued that they're abstract, but how are they acute to essentialism, given how ordinary they look? And here I want to show you what they might be really saying. This was a magazine cover. I took this picture when I was grocery shopping a couple years ago. I saw this magazine on the checkout line, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. This has generics in it. And I want to make the case that it implies essentialism without coming out and saying it explicitly. The female mind, the female brain, that implies that all women are alike and they have a single type of mind or brain. How women think differently, again, glossing over difference, making a generalization as if this category has this property, transcending time. It's not placed in a particular time, place, or context. It's just a general truth that holds. So I think these messages are implying that this is a category about which you can make inferences that goes beyond what you can see in the present context, and that variation doesn't matter. But this is implicit, it's not explicit. And I think that may allow essentialism to kind of sneak in without people even realizing it, that this may have essentialist implications. Now I want to give you a little example from a study that was done with adults. Again, looking at what generics imply, and this is in a political context. So since generics gloss over exceptions, we thought they might exaggerate differences between political parties, and this was done in the US. So how do we look at this? We asked people to make judgments about the percent of Democrats and Republicans that support each of a number of different policies. But we also asked them to make generic judgments about whether they agree or disagree with generic claims, like Democrats support euthanasia, Republicans support euthanasia. So the basic idea is we predicted that the difference between the percent judgments would be smaller than the difference between their generic judgments. So for example, even if Democrats and Republicans are thought to differ only a little bit in their support for euthanasia, we thought that difference would license the generic claims that Democrats support euthanasia and Republicans do not, that it would allow these kind of absolute statements. So I'm going to show you the data. I'm going to show you 3 lines of data, and I have to briefly walk you through what you're looking at here. I know you can't read any of the words on the screen, and that's okay. Each line is a different issue. So we tested 62 different political issues, like spending on parks and rec, or confidence in science, or support for euthanasia, or support for gun control, that kind of thing. And then the data on this first bar are from actual national surveys of how Democrats and Republicans fall on each of these issues, red being Republicans, blue being Democrats, and at the top, they're the ones with the smallest differences, and down at the bottom, the ones with the biggest differences. And so you can see for a lot of them, they're actually not all that far apart. There are some where they're far apart, but there are quite a few where they're different, but only relatively small differences. Okay, so that's the actual percentages. These were people's judgments, and the only thing I want you to pull away from that is that people's perception of the differences those perceptions are bigger than the actual differences. And that's actually a well-established phenomenon in political science, that perceived polarization is bigger than actual polarization. Okay, so now where do generics come in? Even bigger. Almost every issue, the one that was higher, sometimes a teeny tiny bit higher, like at the top, is thought to be, oh yes, you can make that generalization, that's true of that category, and the ones lower, No, it's not true at all. So it's reinforcing this idea that categories are really different from each other. Okay, so I just want to tell you about quickly one more study and then wrap up. We have done research, as have others, finding that generics boost essentialism in children. So if you actually teach them about a new category and you provide a series of generics, they do more essentialism of these categories. So in this particular study we did, we came up with a new category we called Zarpies. These are all Zarpies. Zarpies love tulips. Zarpies are scared of ladybugs. Zarpies hop over puddles. We had like 17 pages in the book. And they're all like a little bit different. But we thought, Zarpies, you're talking about the category as a whole. You're glossing over exceptions. You're implying that they're different from other categories. And we thought that that might come up in their inferences when we tested them. So what we did was, for each, kids were randomly assigned to one of 3 books. In one book, on every single page, they heard a generic about Zarpies, like Zarpies love to eat tulips. Other kids had the specific label, so it's not a generalization anymore. It's not one of these generic claims. This Zarpie loves to eat tulips. Again, every page had that structure. And then we had one where there's no label at all, because we thought maybe even just labeling things boosts essentialism. This loves to eat tulips. And what we found was that both having a label and having a generic were each boosting essentialism. So the lowest level of essentialism was a no label condition. Having just a specific label, so this Zarpie instead of this, that led to more essentialism. But then having the generic was what really pushed it up. Okay, so what can children teach us about the human mind? Getting back to the title of my talk. And I have 3 takeaways. So first, by looking at children, I think we can see that essentialism is a basic reasoning bias. It's intuitive. It doesn't require specialized knowledge. Children don't know about, genetics or chromosomes or anything like that, but they're still essentializing. And I think that also suggests that the consequences of essentialism might also be very intuitive. Now, there are positive consequences. So this means that even young children can look beyond appearances. They can appreciate deeper truths. And I think we all assume at some level that if we kind of scratch below the surface, we'll find patterns and we'll find structure. And that may even motivate our curiosity about the world and our goal of making scientific discoveries. But there are also negative consequences, as I've talked about, that essentialism can imply that different kinds of people are, importantly, naturally, inevitably different from each other, that group divides are inherent, and that they can't change. And the second point is what it tells us about children. And I think they're a lot more capable than was once thought. So as I already said, by 4 or 5 years of age, children can look beyond appearances, look below the surface. They can reason abstractly. They have no problem understanding generics, as do adults. So I think those are those points. And I think that means that children have enormous potential to learn and grow from a young age. And my last point is that essentialism is applied selectively. So what gets essentialized, if we think of that as the target category, what gets essentialized is dependent on culture, on context, on language. And because of this, I end on a hopeful note, because I think the fact that children are sensitive to the cues around them means that they are taking in the different kinds of messages that we're offering. And I think that means that children can learn to go beyond essentialism and think in more complex ways about the categories in their world. Thank you, and I want to thank the children and families who've participated in our research. my research team. This is from last year, so it's a little bit out of date, and my funding sources. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. If anyone has questions, we can take those now.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, have there been any?
Yeah, it's working.
You can hear me? Okay. Have there been studies that have looked at any sort of patterns in changes in, I don't know, the strength, the saliency, the resilience of essentialism in children as they grow older?
Yes, but it's complicated. I'm going to try to see how I can summarize. It's a really wonderful question, and there has been a lot of interest in that. I think initially, like the focus was, like, are kids even able to think about things in this way at all? And then, a lot of research sort of like really showing that that's there early. But I mean, a lot of it actually comes from the cross-cultural work that I mentioned. So, for example, there's one paper that was looking at kids growing up in Hawaii and Massachusetts. And Hawaii is a much more ethnically and racially diverse kind of place to live than the town that they were studying in Massachusetts. I don't remember which town. So it was sort of similar to what we found with the children in the rural community versus the more urban community, the college town. So there are numerous demonstrations of that sort. But it also partly depends on a person's space within a power structure. And here I'm thinking again of the study on that Ram Mahalingam did, where he was finding that the high caste adults were very essentialist. The low caste adults were not. They had more of like a social constructionist view of what it meant to be a member of a caste system, a member of a caste within that system. So they developed a more complex kind of understanding of caste, but that was also sort of consistent with their own identity and their position within that structure. So the emotional piece, or there's motivation that's not just cognitive, but also sort of identity and the emotional consequences of these categories as well. So I mean, that's only a partial answer, but I will say it's an active research area. Yeah. Apparently, yes.
No, I'm interested in your work because I've been interested in, I'm a psychologist, I've been interested in category formation for a while, and so that seems to underlie what you're saying. So, but just to give you an example of a kind of an exception, Temple Grandin, who's an autistic person, has talked about the fact that she is not able to use categories. She can only think of individual instances. So to understand what a church is, she has to know that there's that church down on 4th Street and it has, a steeple and is painted white. And then there's another church.
Yeah, right.
So she
it's
doesn't.
The opposite of, yeah.
And she's talked about this, and she talks about thinking in pictures and so forth. But just to illustrate how differently some people could think, she doesn't.
Yes.
She really isn't able to categorize, which is what you're thinking of as sort of fundamental here. So I just thought that was of some interest. At the other extreme is Vygotsky's studies in, I think it was Kazakhstan. I'm sure you're familiar with that work. You know, where they, again, they were talking about categories, but they had different kinds of categories, and then they would explain to the experimenter that, well, yeah, that's a hammer, and that's a an axe. But what goes together is the hammer and the nail, because what good is a hammer if you don't have a nail?
Right,
they
right.
were very
Yep,
practical.
Yep,
and
yeah, they did the
trying to explain
thematic,
it.
the thematic groupings, very fascinating.
But thank you, it's very,
yeah.
very provocative.
And thank you for those comments. I think you're right that there are, at one level, I would say if a person can learn words for things, then at some level they have formed a category. But the example of Temple Grandin is such an interesting one of focusing in on the individuals, and it would be interesting to see. I would guess that maybe she doesn't hold these essentialist beliefs, but that an open empirical question.
What about something that Freud mentioned, which is that some people, as they grow older, stay at a certain child level of development, and adults who are considered at a 2-year-old level, 3-year-old level, et cetera. And one, is there any way to measure that in your studies? And two, how does that symptom or situation affect essentialism and category formation as a person ages?
Yeah, it's interesting, and so I will first preface this by saying I'm not deeply knowledgeable about Freud, so take what I say with a big grain of salt, because it's not my expertise. Believe it or not, even though I'm a psychologist, and Freud is like probably the most famous psychologist. I believe that when he was saying that there are these various stages that people can sort of get fixated on, I think that was despite the fact that these people's cognitive development was still looking like very typical. So someone could be have a college degree and still, be susceptible to the sorts of, anal stage or whatever that Freud was talking about. So I think my understanding is it's really separated out from the ability to problem solve, to do logic, and so on. So it's like there's that a level at which you could understand someone's psychological functioning that maybe is separate from, how they would do in an academic context or that sort of thing. So that's my understanding. But if there is a Freudian here analyst who knows this better, I'm happy to be corrected. But yeah, thank you for that question.
My question is, when you were looking at the essentialist beliefs for kids in college town versus small town, did you ever find any explanations for the differential essentialist beliefs, like just contact with different people or resources for marginalized communities, or even less socially conservative beliefs in those areas?
Yeah. Oh, I wish we did have that. We didn't formally collect it. So the team that was doing the research were keeping track of, how children responded on the specific questions in our battery. I often am very interested in children's explanations, actually, and whenever possible, I do try to collect those, and then we often will analyze them. And I know that, often with these kids will just come out and say some of the most, insightful things. I remember when I was doing my first study on essentialism, I tried out, it was the bird study that I showed you before. I tried it out on the daughter of a friend of mine, and her daughter was I think she had just turned 6, so she was maybe late kindergarten or just starting first grade. And I went through the series of triads where I labeled the things and asked her to make inferences. And I was being expressionless, so I was not giving her feedback, but I was amazed because she was going with the category every time. And then at the end, she just said spontaneously, I didn't even ask her, she said, all snakes are a little bit the same and a little bit different, but inside they're the same. And I just thought, wow. So they will express, and then with the switch to birth or the nature-nurture studies, they'll often just say well, because it's a rabbit. Duh, it's the category membership is just so obviously the relevant fact here that, they didn't feel like they needed to explain it. I think when we looked at, we did a study where we looked at gender essentialism with a kind of a switched at birth kind of task with a kid who grew up a little boy who went to live with his aunt, and all of her kids were girls, and the other people, and they lived on an island. It just so happened everyone on the island was female. So it's this little baby boy who grew up surrounded in a female environment, and the younger kids were very essentialist about that and said, well, he's definitely gonna want to play with trucks. He's gonna be good at football. Even though there was no environmental support for it, the adults were, they had these very complicated explanations for, so some adults gave what looked like an essentialist answer, some adults gave what looked like a non-essentialist answer, but they had all these, they're saying, well, maybe the adults on the island will want to make sure, since he's a boy, that he has a boy experiences, and so they had these complicated theories, and so you could see they're trying to put together, their understanding of the social structure as well as their beliefs about what makes a boy and a girl different from each other, whereas the kids were just more focused on these categories. They seemed very focused on those categories.
You may have answered my question, which I'll still ask, in your example just now of the 6-year-old who had kind of a nuanced explanation. But as I was reflecting over your talk, I found myself wanting to know, are you saying that children, and I'm thinking, 5 and younger, are they forming categories, or are they kind of absorbing categories that are culturally handed to them?
Right.
Right. And I couldn't imagine, they're not actually forming them, they're absorbing them, but then again, they get to the point where they can begin to manipulate them. And I was reminded of it was a paper written by Douglas Hofstadter.
Oh, yeah.
And
he used to be a faculty member here.
Yes. So
yeah, he was in the...
the title of it is Analogy as the Core of Cognition. And it's wonderful that, as people speak, it's not some rhetorical turn of phrase, that analogy is doing really important work.
Yeah.
And that you can scaffold up. And I think my answer, and I'd love to my question, I'd love your response to it, which is early on, children are very young, learning and absorbing categories, but as they scaffold up, they can manipulate it. All analogies break down where they break, you learn. It's like this other thing, a horse is like, a camel, except, right? And so you begin to analogize your way into new constructs and new categories.
Yeah. Really fascinating question, and I love that you brought in analogy. I mean, I mean, this isn't answering your question, but I will say I was really pleased when I came up with that iceberg analogy, because I thought, okay, this captures how, you know, there's the surface, what you can see, and there's the deeper one, and it like, sometimes when you find an analogy that fits, it just clicks into place. The world expert on analogies is Dedra Gentner, who's at Northwestern University, and she has done wonderful work showing analogies from like the most brilliant scientists to, you know, everyday working people working in teams doing problem solvings, to even young children. So that capacity to form analogies is there at least by 3 or 4. So, but I do agree that analogies get more sophisticated and more complex as we get older. Now, in terms of like, are the kids forming categories or are they absorbing the categories? They are doing both, in my view.
Okay.
'Cause every organism forms categories. You can't really survive as an organism without being able to divide your environment into, like, is this food or not food? Like mealworms can categorize. I mean, a very, very crude level,
Right.
but they can do it. And certainly, you know, any animal that you know, interact with, from insects and so forth, they're all forming categories. That's required for survival. But what human children can do is, you know, inherit all the wisdom of prior generations, and that's something that it's very, very difficult to do in any species that doesn't have language. And so that absorbing of the category, those categories themselves are not the ones that kids are creating. But their tendency to assume that these categories are telling them something deep and important, I think that may come for free. Like, I think that may not actually come from what the adults are telling them at all. There's some very provocative, interesting studies with babies. They're like 11, 12-month-olds, showing that they have some expectation that things that are perceptually seem like the same type of item will have unexpected property. Like if you see these different things are all the same kind of thing and you learn a new property about one member, they expect it to be true of the other members as well. So I think this assumption that our categories, again, they're not just file folders, they're allow us to make inferences and they tell us something new. I think that's there really early on.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, any more questions? Oh, yes.
Very similar to the last question, just to, I guess, clarify it. Does the research indicate that existentialism or essentialism is like a predisposition that people have to follow those patterns, or is it that generics lead to existentialist ideas?
Oh, I love that question. That's really important. I think that essentialism pre-exists prior to generics, but generics tell kids which categories to essentialize. So it doesn't create essentialism, in my view. I'm really glad you asked that. Yeah.
I have a kind of a different kind of question, which is about research. You have such, have done such a plethora of research work. And how do you think about research as kind of the enterprise of essentialism?
Yes. Oh, that's such a great question. Because I've been thinking about that recently, actually. There, independent of the work that I do, there are people. Oyama is one of them. Robert Siegler, who have Barbara Rogoff, who have argued that we essentialize the groups that we study. And as developmental psychologists, I'm guilty as charged. Like, you know, because I say, well, children do this is how children are, this is their, it's like, oh my God, I'm essentializing children. It's very hard not to do that and to figure out, you know, at least we need to acknowledge that, you know, there are larger structures at play, there are environmental effects. I will also say we've recently done some studies on generics in scientific communication. And we studied 12 different highly ranked psychology journals from all the different subfields of psychology. And we found that, and we looked at every abstract title, abstract, and what are called highlights, you know, like little bullet points at the main points, for every single paper in these 12 journals over 2 years. And it was, you know, a fairly big undertaking, but what we found was that 89% of the articles had generics in either the title, highlights, or abstract. 89%. So when we communicate our findings, we can be like, oh, the papers, the results section can have all the subtlety and all of this, but then when it comes to just like, you know, putting it in a digestible form to present, then we go to the generics, and like things like, you know, like the female brain. There are a lot of things like that where they're referred to like the, you know, yeah, the female brain, like that would be, or claims about, you know, different groups of people, like teenagers with such and such disorder. And the thing is, there's always huge variability in any psychological research. So these are not universal claims. I mean, these are not universal phenomena. These are not things that you could say are always true of the category, but they're worded that way. And we also did a study to see how people interpret these generics. And when they hear a generic, they assume that it's more prevalent than it really is. So, yeah, such a great point. It's a problem that I don't know how to fix.
When you were mentioning earlier about there being differences in essentialism across the two, like kid groups between like the college town and the other town, do we have do we have evidence for differences in brain activity across different groups, like across maybe different demographics, and how that might change and what those associations could be?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I know. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Okay, great. So none of the research that I have done has looked at the neuroscience or, you know, the brain activities are very, the field of psychology is really made important leaps and bounds into understanding, you know, brain activation and what's happening with different kinds of tasks and so on. I have colleagues who do this work, including Chris Monk, although he hasn't looked at essentialism. But so I don't know of work looking at this question with regard to essentialism, but I think it's a wonderful question. It would require maybe a collaboration between someone who really has that neuroscience expertise and someone who studies, you know, this. Certainly there have been studies like with fMRI and that sort of thing, looking at what's happening with different kinds of categories. And there's some interesting, I mean, I'm not up on that literature, but I know that at least early on there were findings of some interesting differences, different activation patterns, depending on the category being that the person is thinking about. So, but as I said, I'm not really up on the latest with that.
Has this kind of research been done in different cultures, like in Japanese or some European countries?
Yes. So the question was whether the work has been done in different countries. Yes, for sure. And we see variation in how people essentialize social categories, like different kinds of people, whether it's gender or race or ethnicity or occupation or caste or, there's a lot of variability across countries in that regard. There's also some work just looking at sort of what's predictive of essentialism in different countries. So I know like some new work that's coming out looking at children growing up in China versus in the US and finding some interesting differences, like a lot of similarities, but also some differences in sort of what is predictive of when children essentialize more or less. So I think it's very much an open, still, like, there are a lot of open questions there. Thanks.
So you had mentioned previously in your answering a question that essentialism precedes generics.
Yes,
So I'm wondering,
I think.
you think,
Because
but
generics come in so early that,
Right.
and there is this tantalizing evidence with younger children that they seem to perhaps be essentializing. And because I really don't think a language in and of itself could give you essentialism if you didn't already have that sort of conceptual
Okay.
structure.
so my question is then, what, I presume this is speculation on your part, but what mechanism preloads then essentialism?
Oh.
Is this an evolutionary thing, a neurological thing, something about cognition and perception?
Yeah.
Or is it even something about, essentially socialization within humans and sociality and actual sort of
Yeah.
pragmatic use of, of the body, whatever. I'm just
Right,
wondering
right.
all these
I- yeah, I-
possibilities.
Yeah, no, I've thought a lot about that question, and I think early on I thought, oh, there's some like I don't know, essentialist tendency or something like that, and I no longer think of it that way. I think of essentialism as the outcome of a number of different approaches that young humans have toward the world that are beneficial for development. So, and that when these all come together in a particular, with a particular category, say, then that looks like essentialism. But you could have one strand and not another strand. So I'm being very abstract. Let me give you some examples. I think that there's some evidence that there's a fundamental assumption that events are caused, that things don't just happen randomly. And some people refer to this as causal determinism. So if there's a regularity, there's got to be something there. And I think that's very, very useful for humans because it's, very, it helps us do a lot of problem solving. And even very young kids are trying to solve problems. And there's a lot of very nice work with babies showing that they're trying to solve problems. Not complicated problems, but nonetheless, so there's causal determinism. I think there's also a deference to experts. That's part of the sociality that you were talking about. So children, from very early on, they sort of believe the language that they're getting from the people around them, and they think that it's telling them something important. Now, it may be non-essentialist thing, like I point to this and I say it's a bottle, but that's for the child to accept that as a label, that's deferring to the experts around them. So I think that's a very baked-in fundamental thing that helps kids learn from the environment. Then there's also sort of attention to history and to think that things are sort of continuous over time. And so we care, like with the raccoon and skunk, we care about what this thing was initially, and we think that persists. That's part of essentialism, but also just attending to like consistency over time or tracking patterns over time is helpful for just seeing like, you know, what belongs to me versus to you. I have to track like where it was before, that kind of thing. So I think there are, I mean, I just gave you 3 examples, but I think there are at least half a dozen, if not more, sort of fundamental approaches to the world. To be, children are active explorers and takers in of information. And I think that they have these tendencies that apply very broadly to learning from their environments. But then when you have all of them coming together, because you see, you know, a dog and you see other dogs and you say, oh, they have a lot of commonalities in common. Maybe there's some underlying cause that makes them that way. And oh, I'm hearing this label and that's telling me something important about what that thing is, and so forth. So that's my very long-winded way of answering that question, and but it is speculative, as you suggested.
I'm curious if you've studied at all when like judgment comes in. You know, if you've got a category, when does it become good or bad? You know,
Do you mean like moral judgment?
Well, I mean, no, just like an assignment, you know, in addition to, you know, essentialism, but that, you know, birds are you know, good, like a positive thing versus a...
Right. I think that kind of, you know, like having this valence or an emotional kind of tag is very, very early emerging. Because, I mean, even, you know, teeny babies are very responsive to...
I like this or I don't like that.
Yeah, exactly. And they even, I mean, there's work showing that they even, I heard a talk last week, someone reporting on a series of studies they had done with 5-day-old babies, showing that they had preferences for like pro-social sorts of interactions as opposed to antisocial interactions, which I thought was fascinating. So like, yes, and I think that is part of where we get into problems with categories, because if there's an us versus them, then if like 2 groups, if you're a member of a group and you're in competition with another group, then that very easily turns into antagonism toward the other group. And there's a lot of research showing that even though children like things to be fair, and they like when people are pro-social, and they're very good at helping other people, they have all of these good qualities, something can really turn when groups are put into competition. Yeah.
So you mentioned...
Yesterday, we're hiking in the middle of the woods, and we went over this bridge, and there were 2 mothers, one with a child and the other with 2 children. And when we walked by, the first mother said, stand back to the little kid. And when we got past them, both my husband and I said, we felt like we were dogs, and that the mother was letting the kid know that she should stay away.
Oh,
And it was very odd. Instead of greeting with a smile or something like that, the mother actually said, stay away.
yeah, so that's a good example of, I agree.
I mean, like, if the kid had run up to us and hugged our legs or something like that, so what?
Yeah, so that's an example of like these early messages that kids are getting.
It was
Yeah,
a really early message.
yeah. Did you have a question?
So you mentioned not young children. Some adults give more complicated explanations than young children. So I'm wondering if it's the only reason to having young children as participants, or are there any other reasons to studying young children in this line of research?
I think, I'll give you another reason why I think it's important. And this has to do with trying to understand why people essentialize, which is ultimately what my initial question was. So this very famous philosopher, Jerry Fodor, had written about essentialism before this research was done, and he said that he was convinced that essentialism was just something that modern society does because we know about like microscopes and we know about genetics and we have all of this scientific knowledge that is giving us a new look at the world and has us thinking that there's a deeper basis to categories than we used to think. The best way to test that is with people who don't know about, genetics and all of that. So again, that gets back to sort of like, I feel very, very much indebted to like Herodotus and Plato and, Piaget, of course, for making the argument for why children give us these insights. So, it's adults will layer on top all of these, not just explanations, but, like adults can be essentialists, but then they can also have non-essentialist theories. And it's very, they're flexible and they can show a lot of depth in how they think about a given problem, and it's just much more apparent in the kids. So that's my answer. I appreciate the question.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
First off, thank you very much for that. It helps maybe give some insight and maybe to look more into the confines that we place upon language with our children, right?
Yes.
This is more about curiosity, as I often think like a child many times, and I'm just wondering too, because I have a 4-year-old, so as I'm developing him, things to look for and things to kind of maybe even just bring it to his attention, and then he'll figure out more than I will. But in the study with the Zarpies, did any of the children afterwards feel like they wanted to eat tulips?
Oh, if that happened, I didn't hear about it.
Fair.
So it certainly is possible. Yeah, that's a good point. Like sometimes you plant an idea and, not even expecting. That wasn't something we had thought of, but it's certainly very possible. I mean, you're right. Kids are, it's funny that you say that you're like a child. It reminds me of something that there's a very wonderful psychologist, Alison Gopnik, who teaches at Berkeley. And she has a book called The Scientist in the Crib, because she says, like, even from infancy, children are like scientists. They have immense curiosity. They're thirsty for knowledge. They want to test things out. They're not good at, like, formally testing things out, but they do test things out. And so she said, some people say that children are like little scientists, but I say scientists are like big children.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.